Hello, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute's 2022 Graduate Fellowship Program Capitol Hill Briefing Series. I'm Marco Davis, President and CEO of CHCI. This series is the culmination of CHCI's premier 9-month graduate fellowship program, which offers exceptional emerging Hispanic leaders unparalleled hands-on experience in public policy. This unique fellowship program seeks to enhance participants' leadership abilities, strengthen their professional skills, and increase the presence of Latinos in public policy areas, most notably in the areas of health, technology, housing, energy, social equity, child welfare, and education. CHCI is thrilled to be able to offer our graduate fellows the opportunity to share their perspectives on policy issues that they're passionate about and convene leaders in this work for an informative conversation. Now, we'd like to thank our Graduate Fellowship Program sponsors for supporting the program, including Facebook, the PepsiCo Foundation, America's Health Insurance Plans, BBVA, Casey Family Programs, the Walton Family Foundation, the American Petroleum Institute, DaVita, Wells Fargo, and CVS Health. You can keep today's conversation going by using the hashtag CHCI Fellows on social media. And please visit chci.org to learn more about our graduate fellowship program, as well as our other leadership programs and special events. And we encourage you to reach out to our fellows via LinkedIn to find out more about their policy work and help them connect with job opportunities for when the program concludes in May. Now let's get to the briefing. Enjoy the discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm Caroline Gonzalez-Scott, Vice President of Programs at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Welcome to today's briefing on the use of technology for border security at the U.S. Mexico border. Today's session will focus on how emerging technologies are increasingly being used to create a digital or smart border wall, an immigration management solution that is portrayed as more humane, but which continues to adversely impact vulnerable populations, including Latin American migrants and Latino border communities. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce the fellow who will be moderating today's conversation, Charles Orta. Charles is this year's CHCI Facebook Graduate Fellow. He is currently completing his placement at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he covers international counter-narcotics and law enforcement issues, as well as issues affecting Latin America, including Spanish-language disinformation on digital platforms in the region. Prior to his fellowship, he completed a joint degree program at Harvard Law School and Harvard Kennedy School, focused on international policy and law, where he earned a Juris Doctor and a master's in public policy. Charles is passionate about human rights and security issues, and while in graduate school, he worked on these topics across a variety of organizations, including at the Department of Justice, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Harvard Law School's program on international law and armed conflict. Charles is also a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College, where he has a degree in government and a certificate in Latin American studies. More importantly, he is a proud first-generation Cuban American and a first-generation professional. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'd like to now hand the panel over to Charles.
Thank you, Caroline, for that extremely kind introduction. My name is Charles Orta, and I am the 2021-2022 CHCI Facebook Graduate Fellow. I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion alongside fantastic panelists whose experiences will bring diverse perspectives on understanding the implications of the growing deployment of border security technologies at the U.S. Mexico border. I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Policy Briefing Series entitled A Smarter, More Humane Solution: Why the Digital Border Wall Warrants Bipartisan Skepticism. A major theme for our discussion today will be whether the digital border wall is the effective and humane border security and immigration management solution that the majority of Democratic and Republican politicians portray it to be. When we refer to the digital border wall, we're speaking about the increasing deployment of technology at the U.S. Mexico border to provide border security in addition to or in place of traditional tools and physical barriers. The history of technologies being deployed at our southwestern border for these purposes goes back to the 1970s, during the Carter presidency, when ground sensors first began being introduced. It's only exponentially increased since then, to include surveillance towers, facial recognition and biometric systems, drones, and many other experimental technologies. In recent years, there's been increasing bipartisan interest and support for strengthening and expanding the digital border wall, in part driven by a perception that these technologies offer effective and humane border security solutions. But despite this claim and billions of dollars in appropriations for these technologies over the last 5 years, the federal government has really done little to assess or scrutinize the human rights implications and operational efficacy of these technologies. In many ways, current discussions about the digital border wall as a humane border solution discount or neglect the harms that border security technologies at the U.S. Mexico border have caused or could potentially cause to a variety of populations. This includes evidence that these technologies have contributed to increased migrant deaths, as well as greater exploitation by human smugglers, taking a heavy toll on Latino majority border communities that are subject to more persistent, extensive, and concentrated surveillance than any other part of the country, and evidence that these technologies are applied outside the immediate border for purposes other than border security, including in ways that have infringed on the privacy rights and civil liberties of all Americans. In the same way, calling the digital border wall a smart border solution also neglects the troubled history that these technologies have and numerous reports by the Government Accountability Office and the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, raising serious concerns regarding their effectiveness, reliability, and Border Patrol's ability to strategically deploy them. These are all significant considerations that have not but should be mitigated and adequately addressed by Congress. And that's why it's so important to have conversations like these, to shed light on an issue that not only heavily impacts Latinos, but all of us, and yet hasn't really gotten the attention it deserves. That's what we're here today for, so let's begin. I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist, Julie Mao. Julie is a Deputy Director at Just Futures Law. Julie has more than a decade of experience in the immigrant rights, police accountability, and labor rights movement. She was a senior attorney at the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild and attorney at the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. She's represented immigrants in civil rights litigation against law enforcement abuse and labor exploitation, and worked with hundreds of directly impacted community members to stop their deportations. Recently, Julie has been engaged in legal strategies challenging migrant prosecutions, technology-based policing, and local police collusion with ICE. Julie, welcome. It's great to have you. And if you have any introductory remarks you'd like to make, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charles, and congratulations on this briefing, and lots of thank yous to CHCI for inviting us and holding space for such an important conversation. I thought what I would do in the 4 or 5 minutes I have is describe a little bit about our organization, Just Futures Law, here, and what we do, and then maybe talk about some concrete policy history and highlights of kind of how we got to a place today where there's very little scrutiny around these technologies and the building of this digital wall. But unfortunately, just last week, Congress allotted $435 million in appropriations funding in the FY22 bill that just passed for building this border digital wall itself. So lots and lots of money that's going to this that I think we could use in other program areas as well. So just a quick addition around Just Futures Law. We are an immigration and civil rights shop of policy experts and litigators with decades of experience. And we've been tracking a lot of the tech and surveillance laws and policies at the federal and local level, as well as representing plaintiffs and civil rights leaders in sort of dealing with the abuses of these types of technologies, violations in privacy practices and expectations. And a lot of this work has essentially led us to monitor how Congress and, in parentheses, how corporations engage and lobby Congress for money to fund various mass surveillance programs, especially within DHS, which is, has an ever expanding purse and has resulted in sort of the creation of this digital border wall. So some of this policy history, I think Charles has already gone through, and the brief, really gives significant detail in, kind of the start during the Carter administration, with the background from the Vietnam War and some of the technologies that were deployed into the theater of war, right? With a very explicit goal of, harming and targeting individuals in the theater of war, then being transposed and brought back home and tested. We're talking specifically the surveillance, aerial and ground surveillance technologies and towers starting to be deployed in the southwest border area. And this has certainly, boomed increasingly across the decades of different presidential administrations. Huge booms that we saw during Obama. And now I think we're seeing another resurgence under the Biden administration's sort of DHS policies. And what we saw was that about 2 to 3 years ago, there was this sort of renewed interest from shifting from a physical wall to sort of this digital wall, with the messaging being that it was somehow smarter or it was somehow more humane than sort of the symbolism and physicality of a physical wall. But as we began to do research, and when community groups from the border region and groups that were working with migrants came to us with some of these concerns around this increase in this digital wall construction, we actually found very little evidence to back up these claims around being more humane or somehow being smart because it was, a technological strategy. And in fact, we actually found through the research the very opposite. And a lot of this is contained in the brief of Charles, multiple DHS OIG and GAO reports that demonstrate that CBP and DHS could not prove the effectiveness of these technologies. And in fact, some of these technologies, such as the Predator B drone that CBP continues to operate at about $1,000 to $2,000 per hour, they would deem just extremely wasteful. Two, there was very little attention that was paid to the human impact of these technologies on border communities and migrant communities. And the one study that we did find, long study on the impact of surveillance technologies, actually found a very strong correlation between increased placement of surveillance towers, migrants taking longer, far more dangerous routes to cross, and increased mortality rates. Three, there seemed to be no scrutinization of how this money was being used, particularly who was getting the contracts, which corporations, and an assessment of the human rights history of these technologies. And so one of the big corporations that get this type of border surveillance money, for example, is Elbit Industries, which has been implicated in a number of human rights abuses with the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And then lastly, I will just say that we were very surprised to see just how much money has been going into fund this digital surveillance wall. We're talking about $743 million from 2017 to 2020 alone. that is the budget of some of the smaller federal agencies by themselves. Last year, or FY22 bill that was just passed, contained $435 million alone just for this digital surveillance wall. And I think it's created huge redundancies. We'll be able to talk about the actual technology that composes the digital border wall, but it's created huge redundancies in the deployment of surveillance systems. And meanwhile, the money that's going into these corporations are really in stark contracts and juxtaposed against the reality of these border communities. We are talking about indigenous communities at the Arizona-Mexico border. We're talking about South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley area. As folks probably know so well, these are some of the poorest, primarily Latinx, Hispanic communities that have experienced such historic disinvestment and are, dealing with issues of flooding and basic infrastructure needs. And so to see millions of dollars be, poured into corporations rather than the community, I think is really needs to be examined and reevaluated in terms of congressional priorities. So with that, I will hand it back to Charles for the next agenda item.
Great. Thank you, Julie, for highlighting Just Futures Law extensive work in this area. Next, I'd like to welcome our second panelist, Jacinta Gonzalez. Jacinta is a senior campaign organizer with Mi Gente and coordinates the hashtag No Tech for ICE campaign. Previously, she worked at Podel in Mexico, organizing the Rio Sonora River Basin committees against water contamination by the mining industry. Jacinta was also the lead organizer for the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice Congress of Day Laborers from 2007 to 2014. There, she helped establish a base of day laborers and undocumented families dedicated to building worker power, advancing racial justice, and organizing against deportations. Jacinta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charles, and it's really wonderful to be able to share space with everyone here today. As was mentioned, I work as part of an organizing team at Mi Gente. Mi Gente, for folks that might not know about our organization, is both a digital and grassroots organizing hub for Latinx and Chicanx communities. And, at Mi Gente, we believe that we not only have to be pro-Latinx, but that we also have to be pro-Black, pro-women, pro-queer, pro-trans, pro-Pachamama, pro-worker, because our communities are all of those things and many more. And so, a lot of our work at Mi Gente ranges from doing advocacy and grassroots organizing, to doing policy work, to doing work in elections, particularly with bringing out the Latinx vote, and also by creating policy alternatives and community solutions to some of the most pressing issues that our community faces. For us, a lot of the people who are part of Mi Gente, who have been part of this community building up this organization, have come out of the anti-deportation movement. And have been doing grassroots organizing in immigrant communities for a very long time. And so for many of us who have been fighting against unjust deportations, against the criminalization of migration, started to realize many years back that there was a bigger and bigger involvement of private tech and data companies in the way that immigration enforcement was taking place in this country. And so in 2018, we launched the No Tech for ICE campaign because we started to do some research and started to understand that corporate meddling in policies around deportations were not actually just limited to private profiteering around private detention centers, but also expanded to the tech and surveillance industries. And so we did some research back in 2018, put out a report called Who's Behind ICE? The Tech and Data Companies Fueling Deportations, where we really laid out how companies like data brokers, cloud storage providers, data analytics companies, biometric tracking companies are all sort of forming this huge network that is making billions of dollars off of federal funding for the purpose of criminalizing migrants and creating a deportation pipeline that is even more effective and more deadly against our communities. Part of the reason why these technologies are so dangerous is they're continuing to expand the power of policing agencies like ICE and CBP that have consistently been creating harm in our communities. We've seen a lot of times that these technologies are marketed as being gentler or safer or more effective. But in reality, they're giving more power to agents who are rogue and unaccountable to the needs of our communities while continuously violating people's civil rights and creating more deportations that have created trauma and devastation in communities for generations. The same policies that we see that have been implemented by ICE are also being reflected in the policies around the border. We know that the previous administration under President Trump continuously would talk about the need to build a border wall. We have seen this administration take up that same stance, but say that we need a digital border wall. This is not a safer or gentler way of enforcing those policies. It's actually just reinforcing the same deterrence strategy that has been ineffective for decades. It has led to more deaths, more poverty, and a more aggressive immigration and deportation system that has really, really caused a lot of harm. And so for us, it's important to have this conversation, to be able to have analysis about why we're spending billions of dollars on private tech companies that are marketing their products with very little results, with not a lot of effort for community, while at the same time taking away those same resources from communities that need them tremendously. This is just an expansion of a deterrence strategy that has failed us for decades. What we need now is more investment in border communities. We need more investment in understanding the root causes of migration and actually being able to restore a system that will allow people to have fundamental access to their civil rights and human rights. So I'm looking forward to being able to have more conversation about what the impacts of these technologies are. But want to encourage people to go to the No Tech for ICE website, notechforice.com, where you'll be able to read a lot of research that we've put out, both about how ICE uses these technologies, but also how Border Patrol is now using them in the deadly digital border wall.
Thank you, Jacinta, for those remarks and for putting the digital border wall in the context of Mi Gente's broader #NoTechForIce campaign. Finally, it's really my pleasure to have Erica Hellerstein rounding out today's panel. Erica is an award-winning investigative journalist and a senior reporter with the global newsroom Coda Story, where she covers authoritarian technology, disinformation, historical memory, and the war on science. She's covered human rights issues and politics in the U.S. and Latin America for nearly a decade. Her work has been published in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Elle, Marie Claire, The Washington Post, The San Francisco Chronicle, The San Jose Mercury News, and The Lily, among other publications. Erica, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for having me. This is already such an interesting conversation. I appreciate it. I'll start by just giving a bit more context about Coda Story. We are a global newsroom. I'm actually our only US-based reporter. Much of our team is based in Europe. And we cover the ways that, among other topics, technology fuels authoritarianism. And as part of that work, we've been covering the intersection between immigration and migration and technology. And we've done that work globally. So we've also had reporters dispatched to France and the EU to look at the ways that surveillance technology specifically is being deployed there. And I think something our newsroom does, that interested me in this story, I've been covering immigration for a long time, is we're always kind of looking out for narrative trends and ways in which sort of narratives are shifting and changing. And I was really interested when I learned about last year that President Biden was asking for funding. I think it was $1 billion in his initial budget for, among other things, border security technology. And, I was kind of struck by the fact that under the Trump administration, the border wall, right, was such a force for pushback and such a divisive and political and partisan symbol. But the digital wall didn't seem to generate sort of any sort of the same fury, and in fact appeared to be something that Biden and others were talking about as a potential solution, and like others on the panel have noted, a more humane solution. And so narratively, I thought that was quite interesting, and I wanted to understand the politics of border surveillance better. And I also wanted to see for myself what that ecosystem looks like. And as a reporter, that's one of the things that we can do. We can actually try to go to these places and understand how the technology, really what it is, how it's playing out, how it affects people living in these areas, and really see for ourselves like what the infrastructure looks like, given that there is a request for significant funding for it. So that was sort of where my interest was generated. And I noticed that there in the US, there just isn't, as compared to Europe, for example, as robust of a conversation around just privacy and technology in general. And especially in the immigration space, it seemed like this was an area where there just wasn't that much literature and there wasn't that much research. And I was just really curious about how people in these areas, there are certainly like grassroots groups and advocacy groups talking about it. But I wanted to understand like the human rights impacts and privacy impacts. And I came across a really interesting study that Julie mentioned that talked about the ways that deploying these surveillance technologies in Arizona was associated with migrants crossing through more treacherous routes through the desert and exposing them to the risk of dehydration and death. And so I started calling around to some groups that work along the border and particularly work to recover the remains of migrants and look for migrants who've gone missing in the desert, just asking their thoughts about the tech. And I wasn't sure what they would say and if this was something that they had strong opinions about. But I was really shocked when I talked to someone who does this work on the California-Mexico border. Like one of the first things that he said to me was like, this technology is killing people. And he had a really forceful response. And I just wasn't really expecting that would be I just wasn't expecting that level of force in his response. So he graciously agreed to let me accompany him in the desert in San Diego, Mexico, and then connected me with some other groups that are doing this work in Arizona. And I also rode along with a Border Patrol agent in Arizona and saw some of the technology up close that I wouldn't have been able to see otherwise, and connected with some other groups as well. So I ended up kind of taking a tour around California and Arizona to map this out myself as I tried to make sense of what it looks like right now and how it affects people and the politics of all of this. So that's the article that I wrote. Hopefully we can share it at some point. But also if anyone listening is interested in the global picture as well on how these technologies are being adapted and the through lines globally, I would suggest checking out codastory.com. We've done some really interesting reporting on it outside of the US as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Erica, for sharing your insights as a journalist and reporter at Coda Story covering these issues. At this point in the program, we're going to begin the Q&A session. I'm going to start off by asking a few questions and then open it up to the audience. For everyone tuning in, please start thinking of and submitting questions you may want to ask. Julie, I'd like to start off with a question for you. Just Futures Law just put out a report late last year with Mi Gente, documenting border security technologies at the U.S. Mexico border. I'd like to take a step back. Can you tell us what are the major technologies that are currently making up the digital border wall? And what are some examples of experimental technologies that are currently being tested but not yet widely deployed?
Yeah, sure. So hopefully the gurus at CHCI will chat in the box our report so folks can pull it up, and it definitely breaks down a lot of these technologies and encourage people to read it. Frankly, simply because there are just so many. Like I was talking about the redundancies of technology, it really feels like each year with every appropriation cycle, there's a category of technology and somebody's selling like a different B version or C version of that technology. And so, the first place to start is kind of, what is the digital border wall and like, how do we actually think about it versus what it really is. And so I think when people think about the digital border wall, they're thinking about something that might be related to the southwest border, with Mexico, and some of the very visible surveillance. So things like fixed surveillance towers, sometimes mobile surveillance towers. So if you're, for example, driving around the city of El Paso, you might see CBP trucks with like basically small little antennas driving around the roads. It's hard to see, but sometimes you can see the drones, small or big Predator B drones that fly around the southwest border region. So I think that's usually how individuals somehow like envision the digital border wall to be. And in fact, it is so much more than that. So for example, even in the southwest border region, there's a whole network of surveillance cameras, sort of hidden. A lot of times people have talked about how that might be, in a park, or there's been instances of farmers like finding CBP cameras even on their own properties and throwing them away, and then getting a call from CBP saying, hey, like, we want our cameras back, right? And so it is so pervasive. And that really goes to sort of the invisible side of the digital border wall. And in that context, we're not only talking about sort of the unseen drones, but also first biometrics collection. So that we're talking about facial recognition. We're talking about DNA collection that's happening right now with CBP and ICE at the airports, in ICE and CBP detention. And we're looking also, secondly, with location tracking data. So CBP actually thinking of itself as a surveillance apparatus and buying location-based data, license plate readers that affix to their cars as they patrol, car hacking data, mobile phone hacking data. So if you're in an airport or you're stopped at a CBP checkpoint, these are actually some of the technologies that is being used. And I will say, I'll give one recent example of sort of the Black Mirror scenarios of horrors that we've been seeing out of CBP. But I think the other thing to note is that, the border wall is, and I think hopefully Jacinta will talk about this, the border wall is really very expansive. And so when we're talking about these technologies being deployed, it really isn't just the southwest border anymore. I mean, we get complaints from, the northern border area and dairy farmers in Vermont. We get complaints from, individuals getting racially profiled, stopped at airports or in a neighborhood in Detroit. So it's such an expansive way that this technology is currently being deployed. And so one of the most recent creepy things that we saw was the announcement, almost like a promotional email from DHS Science and Technology, showing that sort of almost like marketing the fact that they had deployed some of these Sentinel, what they call robot dogs. I think they innocuously termed them like autonomous ground surveillance vehicles, and that they were testing them in the city of El Paso, as well as in Wharton, Virginia. And so there was no information, right, around like how many, what's the privacy impact, what's the goal of deploying the sort of robot dogs that we've seen sort of used in enforcement and policing practices. So, a lot of this technology is being deployed without our knowledge, and I think in part because there's so much money that DHS and CBP can use to kind of test out these technologies.
Great. Thank you, Julie, for talking a little bit about the technologies and really the lack of transparency that kind of exists about how much and to what effect these technologies are being deployed. Jacinta, I'd like to turn to you. Based on your work and the research that you've seen, can you speak to the audience about why we should care about the increasing use of border security technologies and what its implications might be, whether to migrants, border communities, or broader American public?
Thank you so much for that question, Charles. And I think, I mean, honestly, you kind of laid it out for us, right? I think it has implications for all of those communities, as you're mentioning. You know, both Erica and Julie have mentioned already how this type of surveillance technologies, as implemented in the digital border wall, make it so that migrants who are trying to get to the United States have to face a much more dangerous and deadly prospect of how to get here. And so we've seen this for decades, right? Because of a deterrence first strategy that thinks that if things are more difficult, that is going to deter migrants from trying to reach the US. But what we've seen is that actually just leads to increases in deaths and increases to traumas of people who are trying to reach this country because they're facing much more dangerous conditions. And so time and time, there's multiple studies and happy to share them with folks in terms of being able to look at the numbers. But what we're seeing is that the more of this technology that is invested in, that people are just trying to take different routes to get to the US that are even more dangerous and more deadly. So already that has a real severe consequence for immigrant communities. People are not going to stop trying to come here if their lives are still in danger or they are still facing very harsh economic conditions or political instability in their home countries. And so really, while we continue to invest in a deterrence and carceral strategy in the US that isn't stopping migration, it's just making it more dangerous and more difficult. The second thing is, as Julie was mentioning, is the constant divestment in border communities. We've seen that some of the folks that live, particularly in the southern border of the United States, face some of the most challenging poverty conditions in the US. You have communities that don't have access to water, that don't have access to electrical systems. And yet you still see the federal government spending billions of dollars on carceral strategies and surveillance technologies that are not making these communities any safer, but are actually just contributing to a constant divestment that is making their lives more difficult. People constantly are telling us stories of what it means to live in such an intense surveillance zone, right? The militarization of the border has made it so that communities who have lived there for centuries are really sort of facing a challenge to their way of life. What used to be a walk to the park is now going through different checkpoints and watching drones, over you as you're playing with your children. This is not a way that we envision freedom. This is not a way that we envision real community being able to build with one another. And it's continuing to just degrade the way that people are able to live. And I think that is really a forewarning to all of us, because it has to be remembered that the border is not this just invisible line that just includes the South. It actually includes 100 miles into the interior, and actually very frequently Border Patrol agents and other border agencies become policing agencies in other places. We saw this very aggressively during the Trump administration, where Border Patrol was monitoring protests, was monitoring civil, First Amendment activity, was monitoring people that were organizing to defend their civil rights, that were organizing against state violence. These were the same agencies that were using those same drones to monitor their protests, to monitor their organizing efforts. And it has a chilling effect. It has a chilling effect on how people organize. It has a chilling effect on how people speak out, and very quickly becomes normalized and then gets trickled down to different types of policing agencies at a local level. And so for us, it's been very important to raise the alarm, because one of the problems with agencies like CBP and ICE have been always the lack of accountability. Border Patrol has murdered many people across the border, and there has been very little accountability for it. And giving them more technologies that they are just using for investigative purposes and never actually have to talk about how they're using them makes it, so not only that it's not transparent, but makes it incredibly dangerous for anyone who's concerned about civil liberties and human rights in the US. So for us, it's not only a concern for immigrants, it's not only a concern for border communities, it really is a concern for all of us. And we have to really take into account that the constitutional protections that we have compared to the amount of power that some of these technologies have is not really on par and has to be addressed.
Thank you, Jacinta, for those insights. It's really stark and sobering to hear all the harms that these technologies cause, and yet the lack of accountability that still exists over them. Erica, I'd like to include you in this conversation now. I know that as part of your reporting on the digital border wall, you had the chance to visit the U.S. Mexico border and speak with a variety of stakeholders. You mentioned some of that in your introductory remarks. Could you go a little bit more in depth as to what your interactions were like with the different stakeholders? And in particular, I'm really interested in hearing more about your interactions with Border Patrol agents and how they kind of perceive this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. So basically, I would say that my interactions could be kind of broken down into different categories. One was a category of groups that I mentioned earlier that are migrants' rights groups that go into the desert to search for and recover the remains of people who've gone missing, or to actually look for people if they think they may be still alive. And they have encountered the technology just in their work on the ground in the desert, and they've also seen firsthand and talked to people firsthand about how seeing the technology, for example, some of these towers or setting off a sensor when a coyote takes them through the desert, affects migration routes. And they've had sort of a really interesting firsthand look into how this plays out in terms of how people are crossing over. And then the second category would be my interaction with Border Patrol, which I can get into. Actually, I'll get into all three. And then the third is residents who are living in these areas, particularly areas under persistent surveillance, who are not necessarily doing work along the border, but just happen to live in these places and interact with this ecosystem on a daily basis. And so, as others have mentioned, there have been, this has traditionally been an area in which technology has been tested out and then in instances deployed to other parts of the country. And so I think all of those experiences really can clarify and elucidate, especially for people who are living there and encountering this and engaging with it on a daily basis, what that means for others who are listening to this and may not be able to relate immediately to what we're talking about. So for the Border Patrol, I'll say I had one unintentional encounter and one intentional encounter. The unintentional encounter was when I was in Arizona in the desert with one of these search and rescue groups. And we were in this truck, and it's really the only way you can get around. It's like a very inhospitable landscape. And so we were pretty deep in there. There was really no one else around at all. We hadn't seen anyone. And we were just really in the middle of nowhere. And we saw a Border Patrol car sort of come up driving next to us and then, roll down their window and ask what we're up to. And I think that was a really interesting example of kind of clarifying what we're talking about, because the person told us, the Border Patrol agent, that the reason he drove over there was because we set off a sensor. So these are the sensors underground that there's thousands across the southwest border. And so that sent off a little ping alert to whatever control center was there, and he drove out to see like what we were up to, and then mentioned, actually, now that you say it, I'm not sure if it was a ground sensor that you set off or if it was a camera hidden in the brush somewhere, because by the way, if you tried to find it, you wouldn't. These are so sophisticated. You could spend hours searching for it and not find these cameras that are also all over here. So he really kind of clarified for us what it's like when you set one of those things off, right? And the eyes that are kind of always on you when you're in this area. And he ended up being a bit candid with us, which I found surprising. And just talking about like how he wasn't really sure about the tech, but a lot of people really relied on it. And there were these cameras, like everywhere. And then the second encounter was an encounter I had with an agent in Nogales who agreed to give me a tour along the border. And this, I think sometimes that something that can be challenging is that there's areas that are just inaccessible. So as a journalist, I would not be able to go there. Like, this is only area that Border Patrol can access and drive up and down. And there is actually a lot of stuff over there. And it's sort of seen as like especially in Nogales, like a very important place with a lot of technology. And I wanted to understand how much was there and what was there. So he agreed to give me a tour. Very last minute, but I wanted to be able to get that lens and see, this stuff up close and what this technology means for them. And something I learned from, this long ride around is that this is something that they also see as, at least the way that he told it, a very important source of investment and sort of one of the core ways that they're thinking about enforcement along the border. And basically, they want to see way more investment in that and are hoping for a continued stream of investment under the Biden administration. And what you learn also is that they see the technology as effective, and, or at least from this person's vantage point that I was speaking to, and that something to be very proud of. This is something that they're saying is great, is really helping them do the work of enforcement along the border. And I pressed this person on, well, what about, this question of people going into other routes and stuff like that? And he said, yeah, you're right. That is what happens. People will inevitably go into different routes and they can be more dangerous. And that is an impact of this. And so it was something that this person acknowledged, but, in these contexts, they'll just talk about how key the technology is to the work that they do and how much they want to see more of it. And I think it clarifies and shows that I would be shocked if this was an area that, we're not going to see an expansion of already. Since the trip, there was this announcement about the robot dogs, which one of the panelists talked about. And so there's, constantly sort of an experimentation, I think, happening. And unfortunately, the year that I did the reporting due to COVID, I was unable to attend an expo. That's typically every year where a lot of these companies go and they show the technologies that they're piloting out, including apparently these cameras that I referenced that are like hidden in cacti or things like that, that are then brought to different parts of the desert. So it is a very, very lucrative world. And then the final, so that's that group. With the residents who are living in the areas along the border, I spoke to a few who are living in Aravaca, which is in southern Arizona, and kind of at the intersection of a lot of this tech. And in order to get out, if you want to leave Aravaca, you have to drive through a checkpoint. And so there's really no way to get in or out of Aravaca without encountering this technology. And it's also, there's a lot of surveillance towers and sensors throughout the area. And so one of the people that I spoke to there, Eva Lewis, she mentioned, and I think this is something that, isn't discussed often, but she just feels like she's in a panopticon, like under constant surveillance when she's doing anything. So stepping outside, she knows that there could be a camera picking up on her activity. She's talked about going on hikes where she'll set off a ground sensor, and all of a sudden, like a Border Patrol agent, similar to what happened to me, will come up to her and say, like, what are you doing here? Or seen a helicopter flying overhead often. And I think that really, for her, influences how she moves around and her sense of like freedom and, her own sense of security in this place. And I asked someone else who was like, nah, I don't care. Like, it doesn't bother me. So I think you do see different reactions to it. But in this area, we spoke about a lot of, the psychological, in addition to everything else that we've talked about, the psychological effects of just being in a place that you feel like you're always kind of being recorded or yeah. And then this last group is the migrant groups that I attended and went along in the ride-alongs in the desert. They are very adamant about the technology influencing people's routes into ever more dangerous areas and corridors. And actually, like right off after I went along with someone, he said, I just talked to someone who said like he was trying to cross in this way, but then he saw this tower, and so he went into a different corridor. And I have these kinds of conversations all the time about what people are seeing. So those are sort of the main, I would say that's a summary of like the main stakeholders that I talk to along the border.
Great. Thank you for that, Erica. For the sake of time, I'd like to now open up the conversation to our audience and have them get involved in the conversation. Please feel free to engage with any of the panelists. And for the sake of time, please try to direct each of your questions to a specific speaker in the format of a question. I'd like to start off with a question from Dulce in the audience, who wanted to know, given kind of the lack of transparency that exists over these technologies, how do you, from a grassroots level, go about monitoring the data collection and just how these technologies are deployed on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I can take a very quick stab, and then Jacinta, I think it would be great to get it from your perspective. I think from a technocrat researcher perspective, right now, a lot of this is like wading through, government procurement and some of the sort of, contracting side reports and solicitations that the agency puts out when it tries to, put out to get more of these technologies. And then also just the corporations themselves, right? They're trying to promote a technology. And unfortunately for them, like they're not thinking about the human impact. They're trying to sort of sell a type of criminalization device. And so you do, unfortunately, for better or worse, like get a lot of information from sort of these expos or these corporations themselves. And then I think as a policy ask, Congress could be doing a lot more, right? This is where appropriations, legislation, oversight hearings, congressional inquiries, briefings, hearings, right? Call DHS CBP into meetings, right? And be able to ask these questions. If it wasn't for, maybe someone in hindsight, the unforced error of an email promoting robot dogs from DHS directly, we wouldn't have known that they're actually deploying these devices in El Paso. So I think it's really up to government in many ways to craft legislation that requires a public assessment of these technologies prior to their deployment. Let's not wait until we're kind of like reading it in the news or somebody's actually harmed from the technology to actually do something about it when it's already deployed in various communities, whether in the Southwest border region or far into the interior.
Jacinta, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share that it has been really challenging to find out what's been happening, and Julie kind of laid out some of the ways that we've done some of the corporate research. But, just to even go back, like for many of us at Mi Gente, we are not technologists. I always make jokes. I'm like, I can barely figure out Google Docs half the time. Don't even get me started. I was locked out of my Facebook account for the whole last week because I couldn't figure out whatever it was. So all of this to just say that a lot of what we've been able to find out has been because people have kind of been reporting to us on the behaviors of ICE, right? ICE came to my house and already knew who my cousin was. How does he have that information? How do they actually track that? Or they've been tracking my car, right? They had information about where I worked. And so a lot of it has been really listening to community members when they're telling us stories about how ICE and Border Patrol is acting in communities. And from there, we've been able to sort of understand and untangle And so I'll just give, for example, one example around, for example, the use of data brokers, right? As Julie was mentioning, when we talk about the digital border wall, we think mostly about some of the drones or the towers. But for example, Border Patrol now has tremendous contracts with a lot of different types of data brokers to be purchasing tons of types of information. And so we, for example, had one of our members, Marumora, who was retaliated against under the previous administration for her organizing at the detention center in Tacoma, Washington, because of her activism, because being so outspoken. They literally targeted her for being a Latinx activist and put her in removal proceedings. And we know that her name was run through many of the systems that data brokers like Thomson Reuters, the Clear database, that they were providing under contract to ICE. So then when we understand how it was used in one case, and then we see that Border Patrol has a similar contract with them, we're able to kind of piece together some of the ways that this technology is being implemented. But the lack of transparency at the level of the federal government in terms of what technologies they're using and how they're being implemented is tremendous. And just want to kind of reinforce Julie's point of like, this is where it would be really, really helpful to have more support from members of Congress, from different elected officials to be asking about how it's happening, because it's literally being used against organizers. It's being used against people who are organizing at their workplace, in their communities, and it's very difficult. And I'll just say also, there's so many stories that we've heard where we're still trying to piece together what's happening. One of the places where this happens a lot is in the use of biometrics, right? So we're talking about some of the corporate surveillance in terms of having access to our information, but also the use of biometrics now by DHS is incredibly widespread, right? They are expanding the what they call alternatives to detention, which is really just an expansion of the carceral system that we have, to now be able to track people not only with ankle shackles, but also with apps on people's phones that use facial recognition and voice recognition technology. We don't know what they're using that data for. We don't know what this private company, how they use and monitor that information, and what other functions or what other purposes they're putting it to use for. The same thing with DNA, right? We know that there's a lot of places where the federal government has access to people's physical presence, their physical bodies, and can take DNA from them. We don't know how that's being used as the HEART database, which is this biometric database that's being built out. So there's a lot of places where there's a lot of just not the full picture about what's happening. And so for us, it's been very important to take the lead from communities that are facing these problems and really believe them, right? I think there's just a lot of sometimes this like, oh, no, ICE would never do that. Let me tell you, usually it starts with a really crazy story, and then you find out that they actually do have a contract to be able to conduct that type of surveillance or use that type of technology.
Thank you for that, Jacinta. And one of the things that kind of came up in my mind as you were discussing all of this is really the question of, I guess, given all these harms, right, given the lack of accountability, why has this framing of the digital border wall as being effective and humane, especially during the Biden administration, been so pervasive and successful? And I want to pick up on something else that you mentioned earlier, Erica, which is this idea that the U.S. is kind of really behind compared to Europe in addressing some of these technological solutions or technological approaches to immigration management. So maybe you can take a crack at that question first.
Totally. Something that really struck me, even in thinking about this and doing reporting, is just that, like, in general, I would say that the U.S. has less of a tradition of being invested in things around privacy and technology. And there is a stronger tradition of that in Europe and legislation around that as well. And so, many of the questions that Jacinta was asking about, what do we know about this? There's lack of transparency, all of these things, technologies being used elsewhere. These are also things that I think society, U.S. society is just less invested generally in these questions of privacy. I mean, I think what's interesting is that we're actually moving toward a place where people are increasingly more concerned about this. They're more vocal about this. And there's more, I would say, skepticism about, like, techno-solutionism. And you see that a lot, right? Like the conversation around big tech is really different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But a place where you don't see that skepticism is when that tech is being tested on in the policing context or the immigration context. And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately, like how we're kind of at this dual space of being more skeptical as a country about the power of big tech, but not necessarily applying that to specific people that it's being tested out on. And so I would just say that maybe people will become more aware of that, but it's something that has really struck me as I've done reporting on this type of stuff, all over. That tension continues to come up about, the sort of, I would say almost a laissez-faire attitude a lot of people have toward privacy. And it's shifted, but like not to everybody that's affected by it.
Great. Thank you, Erica. So I think for the sake of time, we're just going to have one more question from the audience. And I'd like to bring in Jennifer's question, which is about, I guess, alternatives other than the physical border wall, and other than kind of the use of technology for immigration enforcement. What would you like to see the U.S. government do to kind of approach these issues? And kind of going back to what Julie was mentioning earlier about solutions or recommendations or policy interventions that she would like to see the government kind of pursue. I'd be happy and excited to hear from each of you what you think next steps are.
Yeah, I mean, I think just very quickly, I think before we talk about alternatives, I think really questioning and scrutinizing the level of money that we give to border technology and DHS surveillance generally, right? Like I said, I think FY22 bill with about $435 million might have been one of the largest sums that were appropriated for the digital border wall. Like that money didn't need to be spent on that, right? Like that could have gone to like healthcare, housing, mental health services. I mean, you can think about all the other government agencies where, even $100 million for a program is a huge amount, right? Or, federal local block grants to some of these communities for, infrastructure and basic needs, education. And so I think that, one, we also have to think about sometimes it's also not about moving money. Sometimes it also is just about reducing the amount of money at any given agency. And I think DHS is certainly one that we really need to reduce and reevaluate why we give so much money. And then I think alternatives is listening to border communities and communities in need. And at least the communities that we've been in conversation with Mi Gente, have identified so many different types of programs that lack, systemic investment.
Great. Thank you, Julie. I think for the sake of time, we're going to just move on to closing remarks. I would love to hear from Jacinta and Erica, your thoughts on solutions, but maybe you can address that in your closing thoughts. I want to thank our audience for their thoughtful engagement with our panelists. At this point, the panel is going to start coming to a close. And then before providing some closing remarks of my own, I'd invite our panelists to give their closing thoughts. If you want our audience to take away only one thing from today's panel, what would that be? How about we start with you, Erica, then Jacinta, and then Julie, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, well, I forgot to mention, it would be great if someone could share the link to my story at some point for people, because it really, really goes in depth in ways that I wasn't able to, and didn't have time to do it in this panel. I would say I think that this issue will not go away, and I foresee there continuing to be more of this technology used. So I think, an examination of, from a journalistic standpoint, especially, journalists should be really thinking about this frame of technology as more humane and looking to see where the investments and expanded investments are, if they indeed do increase, and also looking for evidence and reports about existing, does the existing structure work? And what sort of investigative work can we do on this, because this is what we should be doing, with anything. But yeah, I would just say, like, as someone who pays close attention to narratives broadly, I anticipate this to continue to be, an area that's going to receive investment, maybe not so much attention, though, as the physical border wall.
Jacinta?
Sure. I mean, I think just in closing and thinking particularly about this issue of alternatives or options, I think we just really have to many times step back and really question the basis or the frame of which we're given this choice. Because many times, for example, as we see right now, this administration trying to expand the quote unquote alternatives to detention program. They're trying to say, well, if you had to choose between detention and an app, wouldn't you choose the app? But actually, we can remember very short time ago that people were just given court dates and people would just go to court. And we actually know that what gets people to have a higher likelihood of going to their court proceedings is making sure they understand the process, have adequate support, have housing support, have transportation, have childcare. These are the things that actually facilitate making sure people go through a court process, making sure there's actually justice in that courtroom, not actually having just an enforcement and a policing system that's going to resolve these issues. And so I think, to me, we have to take a step back and really understand that deterrence strategies at the border, just having enforcement and deportation policies and not actually having immigration policies that give people relief, is the crux of the problem and what has to be addressed. Not trying to figure out technology advances that are going to kind of tinkle around the edges while not actually getting to the real issues that are at play. And so when I think about why some of these technologies are continued to be promoted as gentler and softer and kinder and more effective, part of the answer is marketing. These same companies are actually spending their own millions of dollars, making sure they have lobbyists that are appealing to both Republicans and Democrats, promoting these technologies because it's lining their pockets. And so our tax dollars, instead of being spent on things that can help improve the lives of communities, are literally giving billions of dollars to companies that are just really profiting off of the criminalization of migration and creating, sort of fanning the flames of narratives that are hurting communities and creating terror as opposed to creating real safety. And so I think for us, what we have to do is push back against those narratives, ask the essential questions of what is at play with these policies, and really think about how we invest our resources in ways that allow communities to thrive, as opposed to just policing them and criminalizing them in ways that are really creating a lot of harm and generational trauma that we're going to have to continue to deal with.
Thank you, Jacinta, so much for those remarks. Julie, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I know our time's short, so I'll just quickly say that I want to just recognize that the people in the audience, as well as Charles, you all are the current and future leaders in Congress, right? And so we really need you and your leadership to learn about these issues, do the research, and work with us to address and dismantle, right, this digital border wall marketing strategy, as Jacinta named. And so really welcome the engagement, the collaboration, because we know that a lot of this is, medium to long term to be able to address. And I fully believe that we have the tools and you guys are the leaders to be able to take this on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julie, Jacinta, and Erica, for those remarks and for joining us today and sharing your immense and invaluable expertise on the digital border wall, an immigration and tech issue that we really need much more public debate on. I want to close out this panel by emphasizing that there are a broad range of tools available to Congress to deal with at least some of the serious concerns we've raised today. And I want to emphasize that there's nothing partisan about wanting to understand whether and how the technologies that U.S. taxpayers are funding at the border are effective at fulfilling their alleged purpose and wanting to mitigate the serious human rights implications they currently have. To that end, as some of our panelists have pointed out, Congress can freeze or cap additional appropriations for border security technologies until relevant concerns are addressed. It can also advocate for greater transparency by requiring disclosure of CBP contracts and solicitations for technologies, or by holding public hearings with participation from relevant stakeholders like CBP, border communities, tech providers, and migrant groups, something that somehow hasn't occurred yet. Congress can likewise increase safeguards on how technologies making up the digital border wall, like drones, are applied and deployed, as well as increase meaningful oversight prior to the deployment of these technologies by having a notice and comment period with consultation from border communities and periodic human rights assessments. Any of these congressional actions would be a step in the right direction. As Julie said, for everyone in the audience who isn't involved in policy, doesn't know what they can do, but are still interested about the digital border wall's effects on Latinos and other communities, there's something you can do too. Just stay informed. Make sure that after today's conversation, the digital border wall is part of your broader discussions on immigration policy, because it's as important as any of these other issues. The application of emerging tech for border security purposes is only going to keep growing in prominence in the coming years, and it's something we should all be paying closer attention to. I encourage everyone who wants to learn more about the topic to reach out to any of us. Read my brief, which is now published on the CHCI website. Look at additional resources from Just Futures Law, Mi Gente, and Coda Story, and share all of this new information with your friends and colleagues. Once again, a sincere thank you to the audience, to my fantastic panelists, and to CHCI for hosting this panel, as well as to my amazing colleagues in the fellowship program for all your support and your community. I hope everyone enjoyed our sessions today, and please join us tomorrow for the continuation of CHCI's policy briefing series with my amazing colleagues, Omar and Isabella. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.